found the time to come to the conference. It's now my pleasure to reintroduce you once more to Sheriff Lee Baca, who last night spoke at the memorial ceremony, and we were deeply moved by what he had to say. I introduced him last night, but I see other faces here, so I will go over the highlights of his very interesting CV. For starters, he runs a sheriff department, which is the largest one in the United States, with a budget of $2.5 billion. He leads 18,000 sworn and professional staff who comprise the law enforcement providers for 42 incorporated cities, 140 unincorporated communities, 9 community colleges, and thousands of Metropolitan Transit Authority and Rapid Trail Transit District commuters. More than 4 million people are directly protected by the Sheriff's Department. The jail system houses 20,000 inmates. Sheriff Baca is the coordinator of mutual aid emergency services for California Region 1, which includes the County of Orange. Region 1 serves 13 million people. Sheriff Baca is the founder of Public Trust Policing that includes diverse advisory councils, a clergy council of more than 300 ministers, pastors, priests, rabbis, imams, and leaders of every faith in the community. He also operates 16 nonprofit youth centers, 10 at-risk regional training centers for at-risk youth ages 10 to 18, and provides 27 deputies to 240 elementary and middle schools who teach 50,000 children about positive solutions to the problems of drugs and gangs. He operates one of the law enforcement's largest prevention and intervention programs in the nation, a great combination of keeping the law and being humane at the same time. Sheriff, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Jonathan, for your kind remarks. I'm very pleased to be here. Before I say a few things, I'd like to ask the audience here, how many of you are from the United States in particular, if you'd raise your hand? Thank you very much. How many of you are Israeli citizens, if you don't mind? Thank you. And I assume the rest are the international communities. Is that correct? For those of you that are like myself, coming from another country and excited to be here, thank you. The police chief and I were having a conversation earlier, and I really admire him for what he had to say in his comments. And I also am looking forward to our other colleague who will come within a few minutes after me. The point then is that I'd like to ask another question before I start my comments. All of you are professionals in a variety of responsibilities where you work, but I think this is the ultimate question. How many people here believe that we can win this war against terror without Muslims? Anybody? Then there's a unanimous consensus that the truth of the matter is that we cannot win this war without the help of the Muslim societies of the world. So then the challenge is, we know how to manage police resources. The police chief, the police commissioner was extraordinarily brief with the amount of extensive work that the police forces of Israel are engaged in. And I think there's a lot to be said about that here. But the real challenge is, how do we get Muslims throughout the world to deal with this issue in a way that perhaps none of us can unless we are Muslims? And I see this fight not only from a law enforcement point of view and a military point of view, and also a political point of view, but I also believe that the issue is one that the strategy has to be with the reality that no matter how strong our military is and how strong our police are, we really are arguing essentially about the disparity of what is the right solution versus what is the solution that could ultimately turn the tide here. And I believe that you need all these tools. I don't think you can exclude police and military. But I think that there is a global fear, and there's also a sense of global doubt about where we're going in many areas of the world. So, the issue as I see it is we have forces that can enforce the law. We have military that can engage in the dangers of direct confrontation with hostile forces in parts of the world. We'll talk about that. But force alone is never going to change the dynamics of what the real problem is. And it's a distinction between people of ignorance and people of wisdom. Those are the issues as I see it. In other words, education has a role to play. It has a big role to play in how we go about conducting ourselves. And so let's get into the point that I think this conference represents to me. I'm here because of my desire to learn more. I'm also here to offer a few thoughts. The international strategy is critical. America has a great military, but America does not have a national police department. We have the FBI. It's a great investigative agency, and it does a lot of work. But corralling 19,000 police departments in the United States is virtually a difficult task all the time. What I think is necessary is to mobilize our societies in an intelligent way. Fortunately, Israel, for reasons that are not of the desire of the Israeli society, my hope and dream for Israel is that people recognize that this country is a valuable, contributing country to not only the people that live in this nation, but they contribute to other societies outside the country of Israel. And I can give you examples of why I believe that at a few more minutes. But what's great about this conference is that we have to recognize that within each and every one of us here, we can be the ambassadors of education and solutions and incorporating others, such as Muslims, into what we are talking about. Or we can choose not to use our intelligence other than for ourselves. So I'm talking about global diplomacy. I'm talking about professional diplomacy. I'm talking about us being the messengers of what we believe is critical at this juncture of humanity. That we all have to respect that perhaps 99% of Muslims are not interested in killing themselves. They're not interested in killing anyone. They're not interested in suicide. And they're not interested in engaging in any of the things that people are afraid of Muslims about. The question is, are we going to let our conversation hijack Islam because of the extremists that are violent? The issue of violent extremism is not indigenous to any one religion. There have been extremists who have gone through history trying to be like the prophet, trying to be like Moses, trying to be like Christ, who think that they are a new reincarnation of how to define God. And so when you are able to acknowledge that mankind has a proportion, a very tiny proportion of people who are not satisfied to live in peace with themselves, obviously, and think that they can change the entire world through violence. The issue of violence is partly why the military and the police are so heavily involved in this whole fight against terror. But the truth is that few nations know as much about this subject beyond Israel. The United States had a huge wake-up call that we paid honor to yesterday, and other countries are fighting in a similar context. But my call is for each of us here to not only come here to Israel to learn, but I'm going to suggest that we go to Pakistan, to go to places like Turkey, to Azerbaijan, to the Gulf states, to Jordan, to Egypt, to go into those cultures and see firsthand for yourself and talk to the police and talk to the leaders and engage yourself in a way that is an educational journey. Strategies without knowledge are temporary. Strategies that incorporate education and familiarity and relationships are not temporary. And as a result, the question has to be asked of each of us, how permanent are you committed to this fight against terror? Will you retire someday from what your responsibility is today? Will you choose to say, I'm only doing it because I have a job in which to do? Or are you going to take it to a humanitarian level where you say, I'm truly interested in educating myself as to whether or not Muslims are inherently problematic because of violence, or are they as peace-loving and caring as the rest of us? So I have a huge Muslim outreach program going. I have talked to President Sadari when he was in office. He's still in office. But before him, I talked to President Musharraf. It was Israeli technology that saved his life in the first attack on his life when he was moving from the capital city and he was moving into Rawalpindi from Islamabad. The technology was interrupting cell phone transmissions to the explosives that were on a bridge. My point is, if it were not for Israeli technology, he'd be dead. So there is a value for technology. But more importantly, there's a value in knowing that a Muslim nation that is under a tremendous amount of pressure understands the values of democracy, and at the same time, extremism and violent extremism is pervasive now throughout the entire country. However, when I visited President Musharraf, there was very little terrorism going on in Pakistan. At the same time, Turkey has a role to play, and it's playing its card. But it's interesting how the European nations, when Turkey wanted to be a part of the EU, could not find it within themselves to let a Muslim nation enter the EU. My belief is that business is an economic equalizer. And the idea of excluding business leaders from the agenda of fighting extremism is a shortcoming. You have to recognize that even in economies that are Muslim-centric, that those business people are very, very capable of bridging across the ethnic and religious divides. That they have a purpose, and that is to, in fact, create jobs, to bring forth opportunities for their economic growth, and that they ultimately are excellent at communicating and compromising. So therefore, what we're looking at here today is a far more sophisticated reality about authority. Law enforcement authority is a tool, But the tool should be saved for the last resort purposes. I think we do that rather well. We just don't talk about it as a tool of last resort. But for law enforcement to do diplomacy, as I'm suggesting business diplomacy is necessary, is something new to the United States. My goal in traveling to Pakistan was not because I had a brilliant idea. Where my motivation came to go to Pakistan, to go to Turkey, to go to Azerbaijan. Armenia is a Christian nation, but Armenia buys oil from Iran. And it's ironic that Iran is so belligerent in the political leadership that, quite frankly, I don't know anybody that sees Ahmadinejad in a way that is pleasing. I think many of us think that he's lost his mind. But the man still has power. But somehow he didn't lose his mind in this context of allowing oil to be sold to Armenia, which is a Christian nation. But how many of us would look to that issue of diplomacy that would say, well, if you don't want to deal with Iran, deal with other countries that know how to deal with Iran and try and get in the back door. The truth is that there's 20,000 Jews that live in Iran today. And there's about 80,000 that left Iran during the revolution. Most of them are scattered throughout Europe, but the highest concentration is in Los Angeles. So I have advisory groups. I have one major Iranian American advisory group, and it's not easy to have that kind of group advising someone like me and my officers, but it's important to have it. But it's made up of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And as you probably know historically, the Holocaust of the Armenian society from the early 1915 to 1920, where over 1 million Armenians were slaughtered by the Ottomans, most of them went through the diaspora trek into Iran. And Iran has always been a refuge for Armenian Christians. So I'm trying to give you a little taste of what I mean when you are willing to accept advice, if you're a law enforcement person, from people who come from parts of the world to America, because America represents safety and it represents a sense of freedom that obviously in a democracy does not exist in Iran. So we cannot forget that Iran is not disappearing, but those who are familiar enough with the need to listen are going to ultimately change their perspective on the strategies that we have to use to protect ourselves in the United States, but to also help Israel become stronger in protecting the Israelis and to help even Egypt. Now, last October, I was in Egypt and met the police chief of Egypt. And the most amazing thing about Egypt is that they had one of the finest police academies in the world. And ironically, the police chief there was one of the most intelligent leaders that I've ever met. He was the chief in the early 90s of Sinai region, and the Muslim Brotherhood was busy attacking other Egyptians in a very aggressive, lethal way. And he was able to disincorporate them by being fair to who was arrested and not doing sweeps. And eventually the public got fed up with the Muslim Brotherhood in the northern Sinai region. And as a result, they were telling the police privately who were the assailants. And the police were able to arrest the assailants and put them on trial, and ultimately they were put in prison. And I don't think they ever knew that it was the general public that was telling the police exactly what they weren't able to get 6 or 7 months earlier. Ironically, with this recent revolution going on there, the police chief is now in prison. You see, the difficulty to me of respecting how police departments, even in third world nations like Egypt, are still looking towards the better practices within their own professions. Now, what I want us to end up with here, and then we'll get to the Q&A, is that I don't want to give you all the answers that I have in my head for anything. What I want to do is stimulate you to move out of your comfort zone, because it's not easy for someone like me to even come to Israel. Back home, Los Angeles is 11 million people. The sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer. You heard that. The truth is that I'm here because I should be here, not because it's convenient. Well, global diplomacy is not convenient. I got the Prime Minister of Qatar to sponsor a conference that I hosted with the police chief of France and the police chief of Qatar. I wanted all the police executives of the Gulf states, which is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Emirates. I wanted them to meet with European police chiefs, and I wanted them to meet with North American police chiefs and Far East police chiefs, and we did it. And we did it in Los Angeles about 18 months ago. It was very successful because the Muslim police need to know that we in the West care about what they're doing to protect themselves against terror as much as we care about what we're doing to protect ourselves against terror. Fortunately, Abu Dhabi stepped up to the plate, and now we're going to have another conference in Abu Dhabi. And I've invited the same police chiefs and other police chiefs, and I'm interested in having a wider reality that police diplomacy leads to higher levels of knowledge. The higher levels of knowledge can be distinctive because, as we know, in the Western world, there's hundreds of cultures, hundreds of ethnicities, hundreds of languages, and yet in the Muslim culture, there's many, many cultures, and there's no such thing as one kind of Muslim, as you well know through your studies and the things that you have educated yourself with as I. So we have to say to ourselves, we have to get smarter. We have to have stronger relationships with those who are on the front line in nations that are already experienced significant extremism, particularly violent extremism. That the narrative of a police executive is that everyone deserves to be protected, as the chief indicated in his comments, Chief Danino. He is a great leader because he told me as we were preparing for this that he went to a Muslim school here in Israel to interact with the children himself. The question is, how many of us are willing to interact with Muslim people whenever we have that opportunity? How many of us are willing to listen to their own fears about violent extremism? And how many of us are going to say, I'm not confident in attacking a religion and making the religion responsible for violent extremism? In my way of seeing this, God has nothing to do with death. God has everything to do with life. I choose not to use my faith as a reason for disliking someone else's faith. Now, be confident about what I'm saying with you. And I've said it before. I'm a Christian. I'm a Catholic. But I'm going to be honest. I'm a weak Catholic. I don't know if I have all the skills to qualify myself as the best example as being a Christian. But I know one thing, that I love life. And if people are taught to love their own life, they will not kill another person's life. They will not end another person's life. Now, what's interesting about having authority and loving life is it gives you a great appreciation for all the people that live. That you cannot protect society effectively when you are busy judging someone because of their religion. That is my perspective publicly, and that is my perspective privately. And I believe that each religion has its points. When I was this past Shabbos at the great synagogue in Jerusalem, which is Orthodox, and I was listening to the cantor and the other men who were singing with the cantor, I was listening to some of the greatest music you'll ever hear, although religiously it was in prayer. That the idea of man's faith is why our nations are able to do as much good as they're supposed to do. That goodness is the ultimate purpose of all religions, and that we cannot live in a harmonious way unless our faith is respected. And this is why I think those of us who have the authority to protect must protect the people's right to exercise their faith. I hope I've made some sense to you. I have some brochures here for you. One is this Muslim American Homeland Security Congress that I've helped the Muslims form in Los Angeles. The other is the Muslims Community Affairs Unit. And this is a unit made up of Muslim deputy sheriffs who I send to the mosques. And I go to the mosques, and we interact with the children, we interact with the parents. We have a very, very strong commitment to the points that I've made. I teach all police officers that work with me to be leaders. The idea of leadership is now. Everyone can take a role in the things that I've been trying to share with you. All core values. This is an issue of, this is a war about values. This whole thing with violent extremism. People that are interested in killing themselves are not interested in God, even though they claim they are. People that are interested in killing other people are also not honoring what God's wisdom's about. We in law enforcement and my deputies will kill 15 people on average a year. I've never met one of my deputies who is happy about killing anybody. So the human instinct is to survive. And my hope and desire here is that the Israeli society will know that America is standing for you always, because the noble nature of Judaism throughout history is one worth protecting. In ending my point, every deputy must remember our core values by heart, and I will recite them for you. As a leader in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, I commit myself to honor and perform my duty with respect for the dignity of all people, the integrity to do what is right and fight what is wrong, wisdom to apply common sense and fairness in all that I do, and the courage to stand against racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and bigotry in all its forms. Thank you very much.